So we've just had a very successful seminar out here. That's the fifth Pharma Liability Seminar, which we've been holding annually, and this is our fifth edition. We'll come back and let us ask some of our panelists what are the key takeaways out of the panel discussions that we had. Shane, given the changing landscape and the increasing scope of liabilities, it is much critical that contract with external CROs are well drafted, which comprehensively cover the scope of liabilities to be shared by both parties. So, the panel discussion that you chaired catered to these aspects. What would be the key takeaways out of this panel discussion?
I think that the key point that came out was that we're in a time of change. That what's happening is that whereas before the pharmaceutical companies were undertaking their own clinical trials and therefore everything was coherent because it was the one person handling all the elements of it. You've got the situation now where the companies are avoiding the cost of maintaining large departments, research and development, that sit there and do nothing or very little in between the clinical trials. And therefore that service has gone out to the CROs. As a consequence, you have this growth industry of CROs. Didn't really exist more than 5 or 10 years ago. It's just been created. They hardly know what they are. And they certainly don't know what they do, insofar as their job is changing all the time. It's evolving. And the pharmaceutical companies continue to expand their role in the process. So before, it was simple. You would just organize yourself. You had a clinical trial. You knew what you wanted to do. You knew how you wanted to do it. And the CRO would be a facilitator to make it happen between you and the people undertaking the actual research on the ground. And now, because of the need to be more sophisticated, to coordinate better, and to understand absolutely what the product is, what the needs are, what are the risks, both originally perceived and as they develop, the CRO has to be a partner. And he has to become, in some cases, we were talking about a preferred supplier. So you develop a relationship. They almost become like an employee. And they have to then learn how you work. They have to understand how your computer systems work. They have to be utterly effective for you. And therefore, you have this situation where at any given moment, what they do in this process is changing. And that's why something as boring as the contract is now essential. Because 20 years ago, you wouldn't need the contract. It was only between the pharmaceutical company and the people doing the trial. Now you have a situation where someone's in the middle and their role is changing all the time. And if you don't understand precisely what your role is, where their role picks up, and where it drops off, and then it goes to the local company doing the trial, it's going to be confusion. And I think that a very, very good point that was made by you, actually, a very good point that you made was that you've got a situation where if you don't specify that, both will assume the other one's doing the job. And that's the assumption is the worst thing you can have. And that's why we think that time given at the beginning to decide what precisely you're doing in respect of this particular trial is important, because it sets in stone how you can effectively ensure that everything's done correctly.
Thank you so much, Shane. We have with us Dr. Kavya Kadam, who is the head global clinical operations, and she was on the panel for regulatory and data integrity challenges faced by the pharma industry. We know today that data integrity has become the biggest challenge facing Indian pharma, as more and more companies are now under a stricter scanner of the US FDA and the UK MHRA. Compliance is becoming a far bigger challenge than what Indian companies envisaged. So, given this context, Dr. Kavya, what were the quick takeaways that were discussed in the panel discussion that you were in?
We looked at this scenario from various backgrounds, from the pharma perspective, from the CRO perspective. General consensus was that primarily training is very, very important. And we also saw certain aspects of people's attitudes, how the pharma companies work, how the CROs work, how they get together to put things in place and in perspective for the clinical trials. Another important point that kind of came out of this discussion was that it's not only important to be ready for the regulatory body or document in terms of the regulatory requirements, but also to document as and when things happen and not retrospectively. So we've seen instances of even where people work backwards from the point of view of having a target or an objective to meet a certain target or deadline, and then go back and actually start from step one. So it works from backwards from step 10 to step 1. So given all these scenarios, it's more about the approach to the trial and to the pharma production or the manufacturing units, and how this entire gamut falls into place from the perspective of people owning the responsibility for each and every action that they take until finally delivering the product out into the market.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kavya, for summarizing it in a nutshell. We now have with us Ms. Jui Buch, who is a consultant for many of the leading pharmaceutical companies. Jui, we know that a strong supply chain function certainly defines the ability of the organization in establishing its global reach. So it however has its own set of challenges. So what were the key takeaways that you all discussed in the supply chain risk that the pharmaceutical company faces, and what are the possible solutions to it?
Well, thank you, Lisha. Some of the biggest challenges today that we face while dealing with supply chain is deterioration of stock, inability to handle the stock at appropriate levels of temperature, the inability to manage the political and currency volatility risks in certain restricted countries that a lot of pharma companies export to, and the political situations in these countries. So there was a very solid discussion pertaining to the solutions from two aspects: enabling a collaborative environment so that all the teams, whether it's finance or sales or marketing or supply chain, they could well collaborate for a cohesive vision of establishing what they need to do and how they intend to do it, and also how trade credit insurance and political risk insurance could help mitigate some of these very challenging scenarios of dealing and doing business in these countries, and how it can be used as a driver of growth. Both the panelists were extremely competent, especially Mr. Bhinde and Mukund, and it has been a real pleasure doing this for BCCI. Thank you.
It was a pleasure to have you, Jui, here. We now come back to another issue that is faced by pharma companies, which is product tampering and product recall. And sometimes it's a nightmare to the pharma companies, be it voluntary voluntary recall or mandatory recall. So in such a scenario, what were the key takeaways of your panel discussion? And you all begun with a leading case study of the 1980s. Would you like to throw light on it, Shane?
Well, I think we just set off the discussion by looking at the Tylenol case, which was a change in the way that this sort of matter is dealt with. I think before then, historically, companies, Perrier was another very good example of companies that tried to retain information that didn't want to accept the full implications of what might have happened. And with the Tylenol case, you had a fairly dramatic event. 7 people died from tampering of the product. And Tylenol knew themselves, the manufacturers knew themselves that it wasn't them, that it was tampering because it came from different factories, but it all occurred in one very small locality. So clearly someone who had tampered with Tylenol packets in that locality. But rather than do what other people have done is saying, it wasn't us, they put the persons that were their clients first, the consumers first. So they immediately pulled all of the packets. They worked with the police and the FBI. They offered a $100,000 reward. They became very much proactive on the side of the consumer to resolve the issue. And it gave them a surprising benefit because the market was still well placed towards the product at the end. And they were able to reestablish their market share in circumstances where people thought they never would. And I think the takeaway from the panel was given even the diversity of the panel, there was this feeling, I think, that being transparent and being proactive and taking the moral high ground will almost inevitably put you in a better position, despite what seems to be the short-term economics of restricting what you do, restricting the recall or whatever. So I understand it was quite positive, and what was nice was it's always a good audience here, and it was nice that you could see that the audience also felt clearly and responded well that that was obviously the right way to go.
Great. Throughout the day, we saw that we had keynote speaker, Mr. Sharat Tyagi from Boehringer Ingelheim, who gave us insights on the opportunities and challenges that the pharmaceutical industry faces, and we had a great response. Jui, what is your take on this entire event that we scheduled today, be it with the quality of speakers and participants?
Well, actually, it's always very refreshing to participate or be a part of the audience of the Pharma Liability Edition, and I have been here for the second year now. So the diverse range of topics that we manage, the excellent quality of speakers that BCCI always secures, it is, in my mind, a great way of interaction, of engaging with people of the industry, of the fraternity, and bringing to fore some of the most difficult questions that otherwise people would not have an opportunity to discuss or engage with. And this provides the right platform to do that. And today's session has been extremely informative, just like before. I think it always sort of bests itself in capacity and content year after year.
Good to hear that, Jui. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. And we look forward to our 6th Pharma Liability Seminar next year. Do join us again. Thank you.